Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at The History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at historyguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories of nature's fury in the form of earthquakes. First, he talks about the 1693 Sicily Earthquake, which transformed the architecture and culture of the island forever. Then he talks about the 1755 Lisbon Earthquake, which in a day devastated a powerful kingdom which never fully recovered. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Vincentius Bonaeutius, a Sicilian noble, wrote in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1694 that the great secrets of nature are so inscrutable that we find them far out of reach whenever we go to form a true and nice judgment of them. He was talking about the awesome power of nature in a first-hand account of the 1693 Great Sicily Earthquake, which occurred on January 11th, 327 years ago today. It was the most powerful earthquake in recorded Italian history. It was so devastating that it literally transformed the entire nature of human settlement in Sicily. It is history that deserves to be remembered. With an area of nearly 10,000 square miles, Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean, lying south of the Italian peninsula in the central Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence of human habitation on the island goes back at least to 12,000 BC. Its location in the central Mediterranean made Sicily a battleground between empires. Sicily played a central role in wars between the Greeks in the Peloponnesian War, between the Greeks and Carthage in the Sicilian Wars, between Rome and Carthage in the Punic Wars, between the Ostrogoths and the Eastern Roman Empire in the Gothic War, and a protracted Muslim conquest, followed by a conquest by Norman descendants of Vikings. Sicily became a kingdom under Roger II of Sicily on Christmas Day, 1130. The kingdom would endure for nearly 700 years, although the crown would be connected through personal unions, also called composite monarchy, with other kingdoms. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, the crown of Sicily was a personal union with the kings of Spain, and Sicily was ruled by a viceroy who would be responsible for trying to integrate local powers with the global system and the desires of the king, a complex task that was often unsuccessful. Historian Fernando Cimitaro argues that the competition among the various local political entities essentially rendered Sicily ungovernable. The 17th century proved to be a significant challenge for Sicily. It was a period of population growth and integration into world markets, where Sicily became a major exporter of grain and silk. But it was a period of political discontent and disaster. Periodic droughts and exhaustion of soil due to grain monoculture led to periodic food shortages and near famine. The shortages, along with the economic recession and taxation, resulted in discontent and frequent riots and uprisings. Plague struck the city of Palermo in 1624, killing as many as 10,000. The outbreak was supposedly stopped by the interdiction of Saint Rosalia, whose name is still invoked in time of plague. In 1669, Mount Etna, the most prominent landmark on the island and one of the most active volcanoes in the world, erupted. The lava flow destroyed entire towns. Then, on the east coast of Sicily, on January 9th, 1693, the ground shook. Earthquakes are generally measured using two scales. Seismic magnitude scales represent the inherent force of the earthquake, while seismic intensity scales measure the local intensity of shaking and its effects. While the seismic energy causes the shaking, how much of the energy is radiated as seismic waves differs by factors such as the location and depth of the epicenter, or point where the earthquake originates. Intensity scales are based on local, often untrained observations of the effects of an earthquake, and as such, can be used to help identify the location of the epicenter. Places with greater damage are closer to the epicenter. Intensity scales can also be determined from historical accounts, allowing estimates of the magnitude, even before the advent of instrumentation. The most common intensity scale used today is the Mercalli Modified Intensity Scale, or MMI. First formulated by volcanologist Giuseppe Mercalli in 1883 and revised several times since. The current version of the scale has 12 categories, although the 11th and 12th categories occur so infrequently that the United States Geological Survey only uses 10 categories, incorporating categories 11 and 12 into the 10+ category. Based on the reports of the January 9, 1693 earthquake, the earthquake had a magnitude of 6.2 on the moment magnitude scale. The damage was significant, ranging as high as 11 on the Mercalli Modified Intensity Scale, meaning that virtually all masonry structures are destroyed, with intensity 8 or severe damage in multiple towns and cities along the east coast of Sicily. In his contemporary account, Bonaiutis described the effect. Almost all the edifices in the country were thrown down, whereupon some were very high and strong-built towers. A great part of the city of Catania, with many others, was demolished, and a great many buildings in Valdenoto, Syracuse, were also much flattened. Numbers are unclear, but at least hundreds died. But even in an area where seismic activity is common, the earthquake was significant, more powerful than the earthquake that in 2011 caused significant damage in Christchurch, New Zealand. But the thing is, this wasn't the real earthquake. It was what seismologists call a foreshock. The earthquake struck around 9 p.m. on January 11th, lasted about 4 minutes, according to Bonaiutis, of a type that he called a pulse or a stroke from its resemblance to the beating of an artery. It was in this country impossible to keep upon our legs, or in one place on the dancing earth. Nay, those that lay along the ground were tossed from side to side, as if on a rolling billow. The effect was massive, seriously affecting an area of more than 2,200 square miles. Bonaiutis explained, so horrid and amazing a shake was at once all over Sicily, of which it left, if not destroyed, yet at least every part miserably shaken. Some 70 towns and cities in Sicily were destroyed in the earthquake, with Category 8 intensity, meaning severe damage along almost the entire east coast of the island, and damage also in Italy and the island of Malta. Fissures opened in the ground from the width of a hand to what Bonaiutis described as great gulfs. He wrote, in the city of Noto, in a street a half a mile long, built of stone, which at present is settled into the ground, and quite hanging on one side, like a wall that inclines. And in another street before it is an opening big enough to swallow a man and a horse. The earthquake created landslides where great rocks were loosened and thrown down from the mountains everywhere, and in the county of Sortino, inhabited by about 5,000 persons, a great number perished in the houses which were beaten down by them in their way, as they rolled down from the hills. In some places, wells dried up. In other places, they overflowed or smelled of sulfur. In one valley, the landslides created a dam that then created a lake that was described as being 3 miles around and of considerable depth. The magnitude was estimated to be 7.4, 63 times as powerful as the January 9th foreshock, and more than 4 times more powerful than the earthquake that devastated Haiti in 2010. It was the most powerful earthquake in recorded Italian history. The death toll was horrific. The viceroy, the Duke of Uceda, estimated that about 60,000 people died under the ruins of the earthquake. That represented about half of the population of southeast Sicily. Immediately following the earthquake, the sea was seen retreating across some 140 miles of the coast. The harbor in the city of Augusta went dry. It was the precursor to a tsunami, with waves as high as 30 feet, some traveling nearly a mile inland. A contemporary newspaper said that in the city of Augusta, the tsunami killed many of those people, especially women and children, who, alerted by the big foreshock of 2 days before, were camping near the pier. Bonaiutis estimated that of a population of 18,914 in Catania, approximately 18,000, or 95%, died in the earthquake and tsunami, although other sources say the death toll there was around 12,000. At least half of the population of Ragusa was killed, and approximately a quarter of the population in the cities of Syracuse, Augusta, and Noto. The damage continued. Viceroy Uceda reported 25 aftershocks, continuing to July of 1694. Some were described as being as severe as the original quake. And in the aftermath, as is common with such disasters, disease spread due to the lack of shelter, food, and clean water. Bonaiutis listed illnesses ranging from foolishness and madness to malignant, mortal, and dangerous ones in great number, with delirium and lethargies. Where there has been any infection caused by the natural malignity of the air, infant mortality has followed. The smallpox has made great destruction amongst children. And in short, there has been no state nor condition which has not had its share and so universal, a calamity. But the earthquake also transformed the island and beyond. One of the most extraordinary impacts of the earthquake was in the rebuilding in a homogeneous late Baroque style. The reconstruction was unique for several reasons. Many cities had to be completely rebuilt, some at new locations. The ruins of Old Noto, some 4 miles from where the city was rebuilt, can still be seen. Others on new town plans, others on existing town plans. This allowed a flexibility of construction and plan not commonly available in the rest of Europe, where few new cities were being built. Nobility and power was uniquely concentrated in Sicily and became even more concentrated through inheritance as so many had died. The viceroy appointed a skilled administrator, the Duke of Camastra, who quickly granted the city's hit a 4-year tax suspension to rebuild, and decreed that the building would be around piazzas and wider streets rather than narrow medieval streets. The plan was not just for aesthetics, it was also reduce the damage in future earthquakes. The reconstruction included talented architects such as Vincenzo Sinatra. The unique, highly ornamented style that came to be called Sicilian Baroque was described in one architectural magazine. The buildings, conceived in the wake of this disaster, expressed a light-hearted freedom of decoration, whose incongruous gaiety was intended, perhaps, to assuage the horror. The style continued to develop into the late 18th century, was so influential that it transformed architecture in cities in Sicily and Malta that had been unaffected by the earthquake. The style, which so defines Sicily and Malta today, was a direct result of the devastation of the earthquake. There's still disagreement over the location of the epicenter, whether it was on the coast or offshore, and the location has still not been positively identified. There's some evidence that the 1669 eruption of Mount Etna might have caused a stress transfer that helped to trigger the 1693 earthquake. Some sources claim that Etna was erupting during the earthquake, but actually most agree that it was dormant after its 1669 eruption. While there's a lot that is not known about the 1693 Sicily earthquake, there's a surprising amount we do know. A 2009 article in the journal Transactions of the Built Environment notes that the Sicilian earthquake of 1693 is the first catastrophic seismic event in the world that can be studied and analyzed in depth for the amount of contemporary evidence and the quality and complexity of the reactions triggered in many areas. The devastation of the earthquake transformed the island of Sicily, which thrived in the 18th century compared to the disasters of the 17th century. It's evidence that natural disasters destroy more than buildings. They transform cultures.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So you get to talk about it, in the early part of this video, but Sicily itself, of course, has a fairly unique history because of its position, and some of that's these accidents of history. But one of the accidents of history is that it sits on a particularly complex fault line right through there in the Mediterranean.
It is, yeah. I mean, the same accident that put it in a place where everybody was conquering Sicily all the time because you could use that, with Italy. Who knew that it was run by Normans that were descendants of Vikings at one point? But that same thing put it in a spot where it's always volcanically active. I mean, Mount Etna is one of the most active volcanoes in the world. The disasters like this are always interesting to talk about because one of the things, it's always shocking how much damage they do. And it's always shocking that there's more death afterwards than there was during the initial shock. But it's also shocking how quickly they're forgotten. I think probably even people in Sicily are not always familiar. I think when we posted this video, some people were saying, I didn't know about this. Even though you're sitting in the same place where it could happen again. Because you got, if you got good land, you got a good view, it's easy to forget that, 10 generations ago, everything you built fell down. And so this, Sicily's in a place where that could happen. And it's not, not the only one. I mean, Pompeii still,
Naples. Yeah,
Vesuvius still
Naples
goes off,
is sitting right there at Vesuvius,
so
so just waiting, I guess.
Yeah, as if it can't happen again. You go over to the ruins, going, "This is really interesting." That same map's right there.
Yeah, well, and this is, you're talking about a place Sicily's fairly familiar with earthquakes, and yet, they talk about this particular earthquake was a pretty dramatic one.
Yeah. Well, it's whatever you have, whatever you get used to. They always talk. My whole life they've been talking about when the big one's going to hit California. You can have. Every earthquake seems big until the next one's bigger. But that's. I think because one of the things we talk about here is that this is 10 times as powerful as the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. Because I think modern audiences might remember how devastated Haiti was and how important that was at the time. Even though that's starting to fade in memory too. It's amazing, how quickly we forget things like natural disasters. But when you put that in perspective, 10 times as much as that one that devastated Haiti that we thought was so massive at the time. There's no earthquake that we're experiencing today that's on that scale. I mean, when we have earthquakes, we still have them all the time. We haven't had one that was as big as that, right? And it's terrifying. It's horrifying to think about. Especially as much as we build, how sanguine we've gotten because the Earth is geologically active as it's always been. So the same thing that made Sicily a place that was constantly being conquered is the same reason that sitting there in the middle of the Mediterranean between Africa and Europe is the same reason that it is particularly vulnerable to volcanoes and earthquakes.
And it's I think today we have better systems for how you survive an earthquake, and we build our buildings differently, and certainly they're more strong than they were, and they tend to, and in some ways actually they're more flexible, because that was a big problem in some of these, in both of these stories that we're talking about today, is that the stone buildings that they were building, the problem.
Yeah, it's such a solid building, and it turns out that it's the stone doesn't have any.
It has no place for the shock.
We think we have better systems for predicting, but I think that those are still very. I think today still there's no perfect way to predict earthquakes, even by and you don't know. I mean, it's because they had a pre-shock that was significant. I mean, you would have thought that was the earthquake until the earthquake came. So it's so maybe structures wouldn't be as vulnerable today, but now we have a lot more people that are living in the area where these could occur, and certainly there will still be natural disasters. And one of the things about talking about the history of these disasters is it's shocking the power of them. That you have to put into perspective that could happen. I mean, we've talked about a lot of earthquakes, right? I'm not too far from New Madrid, and it puts you in perspective that whatever you want to say about human history, and one of the things about these two is how much they change history. Like Sicily is a very different place because of this earthquake. I mean, the whole architecture of Sicily is different because of this earthquake. But how much it impacts human history that it still can, and we don't know that anything we think is important today. Anything that we think is the big issue of the day today could easily be wiped off those front pages very quickly by a single massive volcanic eruption or a single massive earthquake the size of the one that hit Sicily.
Well, and the truth is, you very rarely are faced with the actual reality of it, of dealing with an earthquake like this. If the San Andreas fault goes and has like a 9 magnitude earthquake in California, despite places like San Francisco that have really built to survive earthquakes, we might find out that those buildings have, one, been aging, but two, that they were built to survive earthquakes that when the 10,000-year earthquake comes by, that just wasn't enough. And I don't know. I mean, how do you build for the 10,000-year earthquake?
Well, they said despite all that effort, when there's earthquakes in California, and earthquakes that are very small compared to some of these earthquakes in history. I mean, they were massive at the time. The raised highways and stuff like that. There's still a lot of death. Earthquakes today still kill a lot of people. They're still extremely dangerous, and we certainly haven't figured out the secret to surviving earthquakes, and which also can cause tsunamis. I mean, natural disasters still occur today. But when you look back historically, you get you can see and you can pick out some of these, the 1 in 10,000 year earthquakes that we can still remember, and we see that, gosh, we have no idea the power of nature in front of us. We just don't seem to conceive of how much that.
Well, and there might simply there are some natural disasters that we might honestly just not be able to fully prepare for. That's the thing about nature. And when you talk about, if you talk about something more like an asteroid hitting the Earth or something like that, there's all you can do for that is hope it doesn't happen. And that might be where we're at when you're talking about a truly extreme earthquake. Is that we can make what preparations we can, but just like here, even when they have this pre-earthquake, there's no way to know today. We don't even know. We might be able to warn people to say, well, this one hit, but there might be a bigger one. But there's not really, I don't think there's a way for us to say for sure that there's going to be a bigger one.
No, I don't think. You'll hear, as a matter of fact, when we post, someone will say, someone on YouTube says they figured out how to predict earthquakes perfectly or whatever. You hear that sort of stuff, but no one seems to agree that you can do that. And if we could, we wouldn't have the death that we have. And maybe something like you said, afterwards, after an earthquake, the people that were dying of cholera because the water was foul, the people that were dying in the fires that followed and stuff like that. Maybe we're better at that. Maybe we're better at digging people out of rubble so that you're more likely to live. But massive earthquake in the Middle East this year, and there were there were plenty of deaths, and that will continue to go. So certainly, I mean, one lesson to learn from this is,
yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, because there's, I mean, of all the things in history, I mean, these are the ones that you really can't do anything about. But historically, they were also just very interesting too, because you really can't know a people until you know these things that have happened to the people and how much that sticks in legend. And it's interesting to wonder, you know, in prehistory, before stuff was written down, when this was carried as oral history, how many of the stories, I mean, who knows if the biblical flood was talking about a tsunami that came after an earthquake, or something like that. I mean, this stuff, you know, there's these things that are kind of tied into oral histories that they're hard to interpret, that really might, you know, these disasters, I mean, they were massive. They wiped out, you know, whole towns and villages and small civilizations, maybe whole civilizations too, and so those are stuck in collective memory somewhere as we try to pass on the stories without having all the details. As much as we know now, I mean, imagine, I mean, at the time when these were occurring in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, almost always there were, you know, theological explanations. This was the punishment of God. So I imagine that was true in prehistory as well.
And it's difficult, you know. You talk about in this one that it was one of the first ones that we're able to really learn information about because of how well recorded you know, reactions and damage and stuff is. And still, compared to, you know, a modern one, we're making guesses in terms of we're not sure where the epicenter was, and we're not really sure exactly what the damage scales were. We're basing it on reports, and we can talk about this one now and say like, oh, these are good reports. But you know, we've done earlier ones, like I wrote one on an earthquake in like 1202, and we're only really learning stuff about that scientifically based on, you know, they're going in and finding remnants of the fault of where they've seen, where they can actually see where rocks have moved and stuff. It's incredible that we can do that kind of work, but this is fairly recent. And you do wonder, you know, 5,000 years ago, if an earthquake of this level hits, I mean, it's going to remain in memory. You can see how this one impacted history, in that Sicily, like you said, Sicily's a different place, and it kind of invented this whole new kind of architecture. And it seems like maybe there are things like that last longer than the memory of the earthquake, of the specifics of the earthquake that we remember and we can't necessarily decipher now. Because everyone, you know, now you go to Sicily and see these beautiful things, and lots of people commented on the video that, you know, they didn't know that this was why Sicily had this architecture.
Yeah, you don't necessarily write that on the wall. Yeah. So you remember, people remember Mount St. Helens, or here I live outside of St. Louis, and so when the river got really high, there's still marks on the walls about where the flood was, but you only remember them for so long. Sometimes the buildings remain. I mean, these buildings seem ancient. Well, they were actually new after the earthquake, and they might be new again after the next earthquakes. These are always there. I mean, it's just, the stories are always shocking. They always catch you just completely by surprise at the extent of what happened. And it's important, like everything else we do. History deserves to be remembered, that we go and document this and try to remember it, partly because it will happen again, but partly because the history of humanity is also the history of what humanity has survived.
And it's amazing what the ways it impacts culture, and in unexpected ways. I mean, I think that's a cool lesson from this one, is the ways that it truly altered, I mean, the way that people in Sicily live. But you could say that, you know, about the San Francisco earthquake. San Francisco as a city is definitely marked by the 1906. That certainly affected how that city has evolved and built, and you can see that memory in the way that we built things, and I think that's kind of incredible, and how they make these plans. I mean, you have Sicily, which has, you know, wider avenues and stuff like that, simply because their cities that looked more medieval were wiped out. And we talked about, you know, there was some unique history to that in Paris, but it wasn't because of an earthquake. It was just because the emperor still had the power to say, you know, I'm going to knock out all of central Paris and build new avenues. And that's, you know, this is similar ultimately they look similar because they've got these wider avenues, but for completely different reasons. And I think that's an interesting way to examine, you know, how the world has gotten to be like it is, because we have to live in it. You know, people are living in the way that in the effects of Sicily, and how they get to work and whether they can drive on the roads and stuff like that owes something to this event.
Well, it would be completely different if they still had the medieval character of those cities. Yeah. And it's but I mean everywhere you go, whatever great city that you have, they've always had the Great Fire or the Great Earthquake, or sometimes many of those. And it's amazing that cities still survive, because so many of the cities that we consider great cities of the earth, at some point were almost completely devastated, and they rebuilt.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
I'm always watching lots of Magellan TV, but one of them I was just looking at. It was really interesting to me, but it's called Hoax or History, the Michigan Relics. And I had never heard of these things, but in the latter part of the 19th century, early into the 20th century, they discovered thousands, maybe as many as 10,000, though they generally will argue around 3,000, of artifacts in Michigan that suggested there was a prehistoric culture in Michigan that knew Christianity. I've never heard of them. It's fascinating, and it's the question is: are those hoax or are they real? What I will say, I don't want to spoil it for anybody on where it all goes, except there is still controversy today over the things. But it's really the way they present it was great, because they'll have the person talk about this is why this must be real, and you're like absolutely convinced. You're like, you're right, that can't possibly be fake. And then the next person will come along and say this is why it's fake, and you're like, you're right, that can't possibly be real. So they really do a great job of what they talk about in the video, which is to say, is this a myth? Is this fact or fiction? If it's real, for heaven's sake, this is an incredibly interesting piece of history. They're largely not well known because they're largely considered to be fakes. It was something I'd never heard of, which I love in the History Guy. It is history that deserves to be remembered, and the bottom line, even if it's a hoax, it is such an amazing hoax. There's some real effort put into these things that even is important historically. And so they have largely all been collected together to a single museum in Michigan. And the video is about the relics and how they were found, and about the controversy about whether they're real or not. What have you been watching on the history or on Magellan TV?
I was watching something very different. One of the things that we're interested in, and I think we talk about this sometimes, is space. And so I caught this one that's called Exoplanets: Thousands of New Worlds. And one of the things it brought up early on in the documentary was that until very recently, we saw all kinds of exoplanets in fiction, on Star Wars and Star Trek and all this stuff. And we kind of took for granted that there would be planets elsewhere in the galaxy. But we actually had no evidence, no proof that there were any planets anywhere except here. Until the 1990s, and that's actually kind of incredible to me. That kind of rocked my world, because I was like, I hadn't thought about that. Mm-hmm. That we had expected that there would be planets, but we didn't actually have proof of it.
Yeah, think about that. It takes a darn good telescope. To be able to see some planets are relatively small.
And so that's what it's about. It's about talking about how we figured out that there were exoplanets. But it has to do with how we've seen transits and how we can watch the light of a star dip slightly when a planet goes in front of it. But it's amazing to hear, honestly, from the people who made these discoveries. The first people who were really interested in finding exoplanets at times where other scientists thought that it was kind of silly science, and also about how it turned into a very, very serious science. And it goes into where we are, to where we are today, where we've put the James Webb Space Telescope up there, which is supposed to, we think it's going to essentially revolutionize the number of planets we've seen, because we've discovered something like, I was just looking it up, it's like 5,400 exoplanets. It's amazing that we've really transformed our understanding of the universe in such a short time.
Yeah, and that changed your whole idea on that when we talk about life or whatever, there's a lot more planets. There's a lot more possibility that we'll run into the Star Trek universe or the Star Wars universe. Yeah. I love about Magellan TV. You never know what you're going to watch, and they've got great space. They've got great nature documentaries. They've got a lot of really interesting true crime documentaries. They've got all sorts of history, modern history, ancient history, World War history, Civil War history, wherever you go, and they're all just great. I have literally never run into a documentary on Magellan that I started watching that I didn't finish.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you, sometimes a free month or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, the History Guy tells the story of the 1755 Lisbon Earthquake. And stay tuned after the episode to hear us chat a little more with the History Guy.
It was November 1st, 1755, and an Anglican clergyman, Reverend Charles Davy, had just finished writing some letters. He later described that morning. There never was a finer morning seen than the 1st of November. The sun shone in all its full luster. The whole face of the sky was serene and clear, with not the least signal of warning of the approaching event. That event was the Great Earthquake of Lisbon, and it's one of the most important in the history of Europe. It not only changed the face of one of Europe's greatest cities, but it also transformed the politics and economics of the entire continent. It sparked entire new lines of philosophical inquiry during the Age of Enlightenment, and it caused the creation of a brand new science that is still developing today. It is history that deserves to be remembered. While the once vast Portuguese Empire had been reduced significantly by the 18th century, in mid-century Portugal was still a world power, and its capital, Lisbon, a center of trade. A significant part of that had to do with the discovery of gold in Portugal's most lucrative remaining colony, Brazil, in the 1690s, followed by the discovery of diamonds in the 1720s. So many Portuguese immigrated to Brazil, as many as 400,000, for the gold rush that the country was deprived of labor, and King John V had to ban further immigration in 1709. The mines were also fed by the transatlantic slave trade, and some 500,000 Africans were kidnapped into slavery to work in the mines, as well as untold numbers of indigenous Indian slaves. The impacts of gold mining on the environment and demographics of Brazil were profound. The mines were lucrative, producing an estimated 350,000 ounces of gold a year. Officially, 1,000 metric tons of gold flowed into Portugal from the Brazilian mines in the 18th century, and that much again may have come in without being recorded. By some estimates, in the 18th century, 80% of the gold in Europe originated from Brazil. A significant amount of that went to the crown. The government levied a tax of 20% on all gold extracted, called the royal fifths. While collection of the tax was difficult, the penalty if caught evading the tax was to have all your gold confiscated, and revenues from confiscation exceeded revenues from the tax. In addition, an estimated 2.4 million carats of diamonds were imported from Brazil, which ruled the world diamond markets in the 18th century. The result was a great enrichment for the crown. Portuguese merchants also grew wealthy, providing goods such as cloth and metalwares, and of course, slaves obtained in Africa. Portugal was able to pay off debts from years of wars with the Dutch and British, and by mid-century, Portugal was thriving, and Lisbon, its capital and largest city, was a center of international trade. Lisbon is located at the mouth of the Tagus River, the longest river on the Iberian Peninsula. It has a spacious, protected natural harbor that has made it an important seaport and center for trade. With indications of permanent settlement as early as 2500 BC, Lisbon is among the oldest cities in Western Europe. At the turn of the 18th century, Lisbon was, by some accounts, the fifth largest city in Europe, larger than Rome or Madrid or Vienna. A late medieval city dominated by the Ribeira Palace, the 250-year-old main residence of the kings of Portugal, Lisbon in 1755 had a population of some 200,000. It was a city dominated by trade, as evidenced by the placement of the palace along the banks of the Tagus River, near the docks and shipyards. Ribeira Palace translates as Palace of the Riverside. Flush from Brazilian gold, King John V had expanded the palace and transformed its chapel into a massive Baroque church at the beginning of the century. His successor, Joseph I, had built the Royal Opera House attached to the palace in 1755. The opera had opened in March with an opera by composer Davide Perez. Much of the city was built using the distinct 16th century Portuguese Magellan style, named after King Emmanuel I. Lisbon was a devout Catholic city and had numerous cathedrals, monasteries, and 72 convents. The Church of Santa Engracia had been under construction since 1682, so long that Obras de Santa Engracia became the Portuguese term for never-ending construction project. Lisbon in 1755 was also a city of notorious wealth disparity, where the poor lived in terrible conditions, and so had a reputation for being dirty. November 1st was All Saints' Day, and much of the population of the city would have been at church. The royal family had celebrated a sunrise mass, but had left the city as one of the king's daughters wanted to spend the holiday on the coast. It was a bright, clear morning, and most of the population of Lisbon was celebrating mass. The first inkling of what was to come came at approximately 9:30 in the morning. Reverend Davy wrote, "I was sat down in my apartment, just finishing a letter, when the papers and table I was writing on began to tremble with a gentle motion, which rather surprised me, as I could not perceive a breath of wind stirring. Christian Stockaler, the consul of the German city of Hamburg, said, 'First we heard a rumble, like the noise of a carriage.' But then the noise grew. It became louder and louder until it was as loud as the loudest noise of a gun. Immediately after that, we felt the first tremble. At 9:40, all the church bells started ringing. Accounts vary, but the shaking lasted between 3 and 6 minutes. Modern estimates are that the quake had a magnitude between 8.5 to 9 using the moment magnitude scale, releasing, in essence, 1,000 times as much energy as the 2010 Haiti earthquake. The first great shock was felt over an area between 1.2 and 1.4 million square miles. The shaking was felt as far away as Finland and North Africa, northern Italy, and the Azores in the mid-Atlantic. According to author Mark Molsky, the earthquake released 475 megatons of energy, the equivalent of 32,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. He noted in an interview with National Public Radio in 2015 that it was the largest earthquake to hit Europe in the last 10,000 years. Davy observed that with regard to the buildings, it was observed that the solidest in general fell the first. Massive stone structures have little flexibility to absorb shock. The churches and cathedrals full of parishioners collapsed on themselves, crushing the people inside. The sky became as dark as night from the clouds of dust and debris. A significant aftershock hit around 10, and more buildings crumbled. The streets were full of people and animals, trapped or killed by falling rubble. Many, including Reverend Davy, headed for the docks, where they would be relatively safe from debris. There they beheld a bewildering sight. The Tagus River had receded. They could see the river bottom, littered with old shipwrecks. The people had no idea how to interpret this. Tsunamis in the Atlantic are exceedingly rare. Some people even ventured down, hoping to retrieve treasure from the wrecked ships. The tsunami hit at approximately 10 after 10. A wave 12 meters, nearly 40 feet high, came in, as the Reverend described it, like a mountain. So fast that by multiple accounts, people on horseback trying to outrun it had to gallop at full speed. The tidal waves raced up the course of the river and swept away the docks and at least hundreds of people who had sought refuge there. Reverend Davy narrowly escaped, holding onto a huge fallen beam. The water rushed back and then came again, 2 more times. The tsunami was huge. Waves as high as 20 meters hit the coast of Morocco, where as many as 10,000 people were killed. 3-meter waves hit the coast of England and Ireland, enough to cause damage. 4-meter waves hit islands in the Caribbean. And, a careful review of records reveals, the tsunami reached the coast of Brazil. The smoke was rising even before the waves receded. The city had been lit by candle and lamp, and thousands of candles had been lit for All Saints' Day. The rubble began to burn. Many fires joined into a single blaze, burning the parts of the city that had survived the earthquake and tsunami, and killing those trapped in the rubble. The fire raged for 5 days, creating a firestorm, a fire so bad that it creates its own wind. It sucked up so much air that people 100 yards from the blaze asphyxiated. The destruction was terrible. Among the buildings burned to the ground were the Royal Hospital of All Saints, the largest hospital in Portugal, where hundreds of patients were killed in the blaze. The Opera House was in ruins, the Ribera Palace gutted, and with it was lost the 70,000-volume Royal Library, with hundreds of priceless works of art. Original manuscripts and details of early Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama were lost. So many records were lost that the entire history of the nation was truncated. The British Special Envoy to the King of Portugal, Abraham Casters, later wrote that the fire has done 10 times more mischief than the earthquake itself. The assessments of the damage vary. Conservative estimates are that 10% of the structures in the city were destroyed outright, and at least 2/3 of the buildings throughout the city so damaged as to be uninhabitable. Other estimates assert that as much as 85 to 90% of the buildings in the city were destroyed. Reverend Davy described the city. Every parish church, convent, nunnery, palace, and public edifice, with an infinite number of private houses, were either thrown down or so miserably shattered that it was rendered dangerous to pass by them. Castor's letter to England described this opulent city, now reduced to a heap of rubbish and ruins. Davy quoted a contemporary estimate of 60,000 dead, although those estimates may be exaggerated. And Lisbon was not the only city affected, with significant damage throughout southern Portugal and North Africa. The scope of the damage was a shock in the Age of Enlightenment, and the implications discussed throughout the continent. Religious thinkers saw the catastrophe as a repudiation of the science of the age, and asserted that it was a divine punishment, coming as it did on an important feast day, and laying waste to all the great cathedrals of the city, which, ironically, were more prone to destruction, as the city center was built on sedimentary soil that was more subject to the process of liquefaction. Protestant writers described it as retribution for the Portuguese Inquisition, and Catholic writers saw it as God's rage against the free thinkers and atheists living in the Portuguese capital city, sparking backlash against foreigners like the mostly Protestant British. Priests and monks stood in the streets screaming for people to repent, adding to the panic. The great philosopher Voltaire found the divine punishment idea ridiculous, asking, why Lisbon? Is Lisbon worse than other cities? Is there more sin and evil in Lisbon than in Paris or London? Instead, he used it to attack the philosophy of optimism, represented by people like English poet Alexander Pope, who asserted that everything happens for good, arguing instead that the existence of evil is a fact that must be accepted. Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw it as a repudiation of large cities, and saw it as a call to go back to nature. But another reaction was unique. While small numbers of scholars had discussed such disasters as natural events in the past, in the Age of Enlightenment, with a greater idea to publish ideas, for the first time earthquakes were seen widely as natural phenomena to be studied, an idea that challenged the foundation of the power of the Church in Europe. Unfortunately, these discussions were mostly fruitless. Immanuel Kant supposed that volcanic action was due to the subterranean combination of sulfur and iron. Other hypotheses had to do with air circulation in the crust of the Earth, tremors as a result of electric discharge, or the spontaneous explosion of gases in the underground. The discussion of earthquakes as a natural phenomena with scientific explanation was a tectonic shift in itself, but the theorists of the day could not envision plate tectonics, and their discussion provided little understanding. Estimates are that the earthquake cost Portugal the equivalent of almost half of their gross domestic product, sped the decline of their empire. By the end of the 18th century, the empire that had been described as the world's first global empire was a tiny shadow of itself, transforming Europe and the world forever. King Joseph I considered it a miracle that his family had escaped the earthquake, but he became claustrophobic and paranoid of walls. The royal court was moved into a group of tents on a hillside, and the royal family never moved back to Roberta Palace. Although there was enough of the structure left to rebuild, the 2.5-century-old palace of the kings of Portugal was demolished. Joseph was never much interested in governing, and after the earthquake he gave his prime minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, complete power, making him the Marquês de Pombal. Ruling as a de facto king, Pombal took many steps following the earthquake, organizing firefighters to extinguish the blaze, restoring law and order by hanging looters, using the army to keep the people from abandoning the city as they needed them to rebuild, moving quickly to dispose of the bodies of the dead to prevent disease, and rebuilding the city on a new, modern plan that included new architecture known as the Pombaline style, that was some of the first construction ever built to resist earthquakes using flexible wooden structure. Using his power, Pombal engaged in numerous reforms, but also used that power to attack his enemies, becoming a virtual dictator. Perhaps most importantly, Pombal sent throughout the country a series of detailed questions about the earthquake. What time it happened, how long it shook, what direction it came from, what direction buildings fell, when the tsunami hit, how tall the tsunami was. And that data allowed a scientific reconstruction of the event, and thus is seen as the foundation of the science of seismology, the scientific study of earthquakes. And that discipline still today continues to try to understand and predict seismic events and mitigate their effects.
So as you begin this episode, the Portuguese Empire is certainly not like unknown. I think most people understand that Portuguese had this overseas empire.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot lesser known in just...
Yeah, I don't think people, and the thing is, it was the largest, it was the first, really, and in many ways it was the largest, I don't think, I mean, we think about the British Empire or something like that, that was nothing at the time, I mean, no one thought about the British Empire. Matter of fact, that first agreement with the Pope, about, Portugal gets the East and Spain gets the West. I mean, that really shows that's where the competition was. So, and the thing is, it was still an important empire and a vibrant empire in the 18th century. So, I mean, you get to the First World War, and Portugal participated in the First World War because of its empire, but its participation in the First World War was small and almost weird. But if you think about it, if Portugal had the remnant of empire in the same size that England did, when you rolled into the 20th century, how different would the world wars in the 20th century have been? But the Portuguese Empire, I mean, was literally shattered in this one earthquake. And we talk a lot about earthquakes, but I mean, like I said, this is the largest earthquake that has hit Europe in 10,000 years. and it hit one of the largest cities in Europe, and one that was, for many reasons, uniquely vulnerable to it. So, I mean, it literally, absolutely took one of the most powerful states in the world and transformed it into, a state whose participation is now barely remembered.
It's incredible how that happened. Portugal, we talked a little bit about it in some History Guy episodes. Before England had, an empire in India, before there was British India, there was Portuguese India. And that was part of what Portugal get the East, was part of what that was about, was that Portugal had all of these trading colonies and power throughout they controlled the spice trade for a long time, and that was significant. And now it's,
and the British and French ability to come and take away those Portuguese territories really had to do with what happened in the earthquake, and so it's. Yeah, there's a lot of things that change history, but this is rarely can you. It's almost like talking about Troy disappearing or Atlantis disappearing. That you really had this super incredibly powerful empire that almost overnight is just transformed, and it loses this great majority of its wealth and the great majority of its power, so that the empire fritters away in just a few years. That's if that could happen to Portugal in the 18th century, then maybe there was some version of Atlantis, some version of a civilization that literally one cataclysmic event and then was forgotten.
And that's once we get into the modern era, Portugal seems like a sidelined state. They're out there doing Portuguese things in Portugal, but that's it, and they don't really have a.
And there's still some empire stuff going on too. But you don't think in the 19th and 20th century, you don't think of Portugal as one of the major players in the world stage. And they certainly were until the mid 18th century, and we would remember them differently if this earthquake hadn't occurred. I almost certainly would remember differently if this earthquake hadn't occurred. And there's more interesting about it too, because it's really where the first kind of real study of volcanology and earthquakes and seismology and really trying to understand it began. And they didn't know what was going on at all, but this is where they first tried to say, can we look at this in some sort of scientific sense? But at the same time too, certainly there was an awful lot of looking at it from a mystical religious sense too. The Catholics thought that they were being punished for Protestantism, and the Protestants thought they were being punished for the Inquisition. Everybody had a different, because how do you explain something this massive? And it is the quintessential example of the aftermath being more powerful than the earthquake was so powerful, hit on a religious holiday, which meant both that it had that meaning to the population, but also that everybody was in the biggest buildings in town. They all fell down on them, there's a lot of it not only vastly increased the casualties, but it really vastly increased that argument that this was some sort of punishment from God. But the fire afterwards, the tsunami afterwards, which is something they had no experience with, everybody had run to the docks to escape the fire, and then the tsunami comes and washes everybody off the docks. And it's just hard to imagine the level of devastation. And then your house is falling down. If you manage to get outside of your house, then all of a sudden the whole street's on fire. So you manage to get down to the dock where the street's not on fire, and then there's a 20-meter wave coming up the street. And, it's fascinating that the royal family didn't happen to be there. That they were, that has all sorts of religious significance to it too. And it's like a disaster movie today. You watch like a modern disaster movie, and it's almost comic because there's always something going on, because you have to keep the adventure up, and that's what it was like. You should write a disaster movie that's occurring in the Portuguese earthquake.
Every step was something new and horrible. The firestorm
and if you lived through it, you had to think that was an act of God.
And it was rife with metaphor. I do not blame them. If this happened today on an incredibly religious holiday, and specifically killed lots of more people because they were at church, and then the fire partially starts because people all had their candles out for All Saints Day, you would see quite a few people saying, "Oh, it seems difficult to imagine that this wasn't, sent by God."
Yeah, we would even today be saying this was an act of God. This is punishment.
At the time they had essentially no other explanation, and I understand how it really.
Yeah, no one knew. The explanations for why earthquakes occurred are almost comic when you look at it. So this is the first time they started to try to ask the question beyond God's mad at you, but then no one understood plate tectonics or anything that would explain why you get earthquakes when you get earthquakes. But this first time this is the first real attempt to measure the magnitude of an earthquake based on the damage, because there was such clear damage reporting. And so it's really fascinating. And certainly, I mean, it's, Lisbon is still one of the world's great cities, and it is still in the same place where
I
those
have
can
to
occur.
wonder. I mean, you mentioned in the video too. Of course, it was a big city that had many of the problems that all those old medieval cities essentially had, which was that it was dirty and stuff like that. So, but
Narrow
yeah,
streets, a lot of stuff built out of wood that could burn down any time. There was a lot of disparity between wealth. There were a lot of massive buildings because the city was very wealthy, and those buildings were the ones that were most vulnerable to the earthquakes.
and yet it still must have been an incredible city to visit pre-set, and I mean it still is today, but pre 1755. I mean, there were sites that
That was. I mean, it was a city that everybody in the world wanted to see, and it had a whole lot of international population because of that. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. But I mean, compared to many of the earthquakes in history, it's if you go to Lisbon today, I mean, one of the things you're going to do is visit the ruins of the churches. I mean, they've actually stabilized some of those ruins. You can actually go see how massive and this was, and how much it was destroyed. So it's probably more well remembered than a lot of the major earthquakes were. We were talking, before about how quickly these things are forgotten. But I wonder if you live in Lisbon, if you're in the back of your head all the time, is that could happen again, anytime.
That's one of the things every time we do one of these earthquakes, now it's fairly well known, and every time there's any kind of earthquake and you see it in the movies, you see that the water is going to leave before it comes back. And so every time in the story when you hear, the everything was dry and people are like, oh, this is incredible, and they walk around to see it, and to a modern audience you're like, oh, disaster is about to hit.
This earthquake comes and knocks half the town down. It's on fire. You run down to the dock and the water's gone. And they're like, that's peculiar.
Where'd you think
the
water went? Because I would have been really surprised by that too. Because now we know that's something that happens. But if you're someone who is, they didn't even especially have
They had no idea. No one had heard of a tsunami in
they didn't
Europe.
have they didn't have any experience. I mean, in Sicily, there were earthquakes, nothing like what hit them they're in far back in history, but essentially, the people living there would have had memory of earthquakes. And in Lisbon, I mean, they just didn't have the same kind of memory of any kind of thing. And still, the tsunami. I mean, today, those when we have those big earthquakes, like we've had several, in the last couple of decades in Indonesia and stuff like that. Those tsunamis are devastating, and it is difficult. But now at least, usually, when that happens, the first thing you try to do is get to high ground, and you can see in these places.
Yeah, at least most people know that. And a lot of places, I mean, like Washington, etc., they've tried to make they make the safe spots, to run uphill, but. I think tsunami, even in America, which is relatively developed and relatively modern, and has scientists that are looking. I think that if we had like a major earthquake, say on the West Coast, that the tsunami could still kill an awful lot of people who wouldn't have any idea where to go.
Well, and you don't have very long to think about it. I think that's when we watch our disaster movies and stuff like that. It's easy when we're sitting in our couches, but with these folks, just like it would be today, even though we have more knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, now we've got live footage of tsunamis occurring in Japan or in Indonesia, and it is shockingly fast, and it's shocking.
So I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah, certainly the lesson of these, and we've talked about a lot of earthquakes, but the lesson in these partly is just nature is really powerful. But it always surprises you too how much that transformed history, and then it also surprises you about how we've still not figured this out. The lessons that we've learned since, we are still as vulnerable to these disasters as we always were.
And there's a tragedy here too. We've talked about. We've had numerous episodes that talk about this loss of history, and so of course this had a major impact on history, and it made its mark and all of that. But it also caused the burning of records that we'll never get back, and information that really could have could have been of incredible historical importance today, and that we will never know because it was burned in the firestorm that was I can't even imagine a firestorm so great that people 100 yards away have no oxygen. They're asphyxiating. I mean, that is an absolute terror. I don't know. I mean, that would be terrifying. I can't imagine in this barely post-medieval world what you think of watching people just essentially fall over dead that far away from the fire. I mean, that's just got to be terrifying. And that's where Lisbon was hit by something, and then again and again and again in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah, what Man, yeah, at the end of that, yeah. And then you're, disease and famine and water, and I mean,
It must have taken forever to rebuild.
And I think, is a story of human history. I mean, what happens is this disaster hits and all sorts of people die, and then 1,000 years later, another disaster hits and all sorts of people die, and in between, people live totally ignorant that that's going to happen.
And that's
you got hundreds or thousands of years in between of generations of people where life is good, and then
disaster, and it's always unexpected. Every time that you don't expect it to happen, and then, and I just.
So I mean, lots of people have experienced disaster in modern times. I wouldn't minimize that in any way, but I mean, you have to wonder if what we think of as good times today, if we're just those people in between, if every one of us is sitting next to wherever the earthquake or the volcano is,
we have no idea, because there's lots of people who lived that way, and we certainly, this one where they essentially had no warning at all. It's not even like the Sicily one where there was like a pre-earthquake a couple of days before. I mean, literally, it just started shaking. You're just living your normal life, normal day, and then this size earthquake hits.
In this mighty city, in this mighty empire, and I mean, there were a lot of people living in poverty, but there were people living in opulent wealth. I mean, you had to think that Lisbon nothing's going to happen to Lisbon. The city is too much, too powerful. It's too
how
much.
Could you imagine that in a day? Everything will be different, and then you're dealing with fires and disease, and you understand how when that hits up your the center of your empire and of your bureaucracy and of your records, that completely destabilized the entire empire, because all those other places had to keep surviving. Afterward, people had to live there. I'm sure that England and France and other powers saw that vacuum. I mean, that's just how it worked. Is that.
Absolutely. Though, I mean, one of the interesting things about it is because the king decided that he just didn't want to deal with things anymore. I mean, it's clear that he lived PTSD the rest of his life. But he put his prime minister in charge, and his prime minister, almost as a dictator, engaged in amazing reforms because in the rebuilding, and so there was some modernization there. And they literally went out and they asked every village, when did this happen? When did you feel the shake? In order to figure out how far earthquakes went and stuff like that. They learned so much about earthquakes, but another medieval city that was completely rebuilt. After 1755, it's a completely different city because of that, and again, it just absolutely transformed history. And one of the things that came out of it was someone that, saw a modern enough view to, to make changes because of it. But truly, I mean, that was the end of the Portuguese Empire. I mean, at that point, they went from a very powerful empire to a poor country. That was.
You can't always point to a single event that, this is when it happened, but this is one that very, very
we don't know about the fall of the Roman Empire, but we have a darn good idea of the fall of the Portuguese
Empire. The fall of the Roman one's always an interesting one about when it exactly happened. But at least with Portugal, you're looking at, you're like, well, there's a before 1755 and an after 1755.
There's an after 1755, and it's a pretty dramatic difference. Though you might argue that the empire was in decline also before that.
But it's I mean, there's been lots of points where an empire's in decline and then it has some kind of renaissance that helps it survive. I mean, that you could say that with Rome many times, is that Rome existed for a very long time and it had periods of crisis, and then periods where you would have the five good emperors and stuff like that, where things would be relatively okay. And so you still made me think that it would, like we were talking about earlier, these counterfactual ideas of what the world might have looked like if Portugal had been able to maintain that.
Yeah, if Portugal was a much big player on the international stage, bigger player on the international stage rolling into the 20th century, when Europe saw an awful lot of conflict, what might that have meant? I mean, even in the rest of the 18th and 19th century too, because there was an awful lot of conflict going on with it. So it is. I mean, the fact that you so changed the chessboard absolutely impacts history following that. And so it's interesting as a counterfactual to say, what if the Portuguese Empire had survived, was still powerful into the
even
20th
with
century.
we can talk about the Habsburg Empire by World War I was certainly, you could argue, it was in decline, and yet World War I had all
they were a major belligerent.
It had a lot to do with these aging empires and the fact they're tangled alliances. And Portugal, if they had
I mean, there's a big argument that World War I was really caused by that, because of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans and all that.
It's interesting. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.